The gallows stood in the center of Dry Creek, a black silhouette against the blood-red sunset, the rope swaying slightly in the warm evening wind, and the whole town gathered to watch justice, or what passed for it in those days, play out. He was a drifter, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of worn steel and a face that carried the dust of 1,000 miles, accused of robbing the stagecoach that had brought the town's payroll and killing the driver in cold blood, though the only real evidence was the word of the sheriff's brother, a man known for cheating cards and worse. The crowd muttered as the sheriff read the sentence, but the drifter stood unshaken, chains on his wrists, voice low and steady as he looked straight at the only person in the crowd who met his gaze without hatred, the widow Margaret Harlow, a woman whose quiet dignity had been carved out of years of heartbreak and survival, whose husband had been gunned down 2 winters ago by men no jury dared convict, and whose spirit had been forged in the fire of loss. "Hang me if you have to," he called to her, his voice carrying over the murmurs, "but I swear on my life I didn't kill that man. You know I didn't." The words hit her like a shot, because deep down, she did know. She'd seen him weeks before, helping her fix the barn roof without asking a penny, bringing wood to her door when the snow was deep, and she knew that the kind of man who'd do those things wasn't the kind who'd take a life for a bag of gold. The sheriff barked for the crowd to clear, but Margaret didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there until the last of the daylight bled from the sky. And that night she sat by her cold hearth, staring into the flames until they became visions of her own past, of her husband's killer walking free, of the lawmen who turned their eyes away, of the rot that spread when justice was for sale. By morning, she'd made her choice, and it wasn't one she could ever turn back from. She rode into town with her father's old rifle slung across her back and a look that made men step aside without a word, marched straight into the jailhouse where the sheriff sat with his boots on the desk, and leveled the barrel at his chest. "Keys," she said, nothing more, and when he hesitated, she cocked the hammer. They clattered onto the floor, and she caught them without breaking her stare. The drifter was in the cell, leaning against the wall like a man waiting for the inevitable, but when she unlocked the door and shoved the rifle into his hands, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, not gratitude exactly, but the sharp understanding that she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. Together they slipped out the back, her horse carrying them into the hills before the alarm could be raised, riding hard through the canyons and over the ridges where the laws reached thin to nothing but dust and shadows. For days they hid in a forgotten mining shack, surviving on what little she'd packed and what he could hunt, and at night he told her his story, how he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, how the sheriff's brother had planted the stolen gold in his saddlebags, how the real killer was drinking whiskey in the saloon that very moment. She listened, not because she needed convincing, but because every word fed the fire she'd been carrying for years, the same fire that made her say, "We're going back, and this time, it's the truth that's going to hang someone." They rode into Dry Creek before dawn, the sky just turning silver, and stormed into the saloon where the sheriff's brother was sprawled at a table, pistol on his hip, smirk on his lips. It didn't last long. The drifter had him by the collar before he could draw, and Margaret stood in the doorway with her rifle ready, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You're going to tell them exactly what you did, and you're going to do it loud enough for every soul in this town to hear." And he did. Not because he wanted to, but because he saw in her eyes what every man in that room saw. The promise that she would burn every shred of law in that town to the ground if it meant justice was done. By the time the sun rose, the drifter was free, the real killer was in chains, and the sheriff, red-faced with shame, tore down the gallows with his own hands. The town never spoke of it much afterward, but they remembered, and they looked at Margaret Harlow differently, not just as the lonely widow in the house at the edge of town, but as the woman who proved that when the law fails, the heart still knows what's right. And if you believe in stories of grit, redemption, and the kind of courage that makes the world shake, then ride with us. Hit that subscribe button now, because there are more legends coming from the Wild West that you won't want to miss.